tell me about the book you two wrote, Gods, Heroes, and Groups.
Yeah, there's these two distinct fields that I've found are really impactful, at least in my work with psychology and in the world of therapy. I've been really impressed with therapists who have been able to use kind of post-Jungian concepts around archetypes, and Robert Bly was my favorite. But looking at how myths are a gateway to the unconscious, and the characters that we see over and over again in different stories, these stories that we compulsively tell ourselves, those show up, and they show up in ways that are relevant for individual personal development and psychology. And you'll see really brilliant therapists bring those into the room with their clients. And then on the flip side, I was doing wilderness therapy early in my career, and there was, you're working with dysfunctional groups, and you're working with them in a very intense setting. It's like 8 to 12 adolescent boys that all have maladaptive coping skills, and you got the guide team, and it's just, you cannot escape these group dynamics that are happening. And so I looked at these two pieces that I thought were really important, and Aodhán and I are looking out, and there's just not a lot of talking between the two of them. And so the hope was that we can basically begin that conversation. And I think that we ended up surprising ourselves with how much insight we were able to glean from that.
Yeah.
And I think it's like the beginning of what I would consider like a new little niche if people take it up. Maybe no one gives a shit, I don't. But it's to me, it's fascinating.
I find it fascinating. Yeah. That you would apply mythology and then archetypal dynamics to groups. It's really interesting that you'd actually kind of make this argument that in some ways the mythological stories that we see play over in different societies maybe tell us something about these group dynamics. Mm-hmm. It made me think that maybe part of the reason why we tell such mythological archetypal stories is to help us explain group dynamics that perhaps we're part of, but it's hard to spot, it's hard to notice. And then maybe one of the best ways to understand them is to tell stories about them. So tell me a bit more about then, why we'd think that these mythological stories would apply to help us understand groups. And what is there to understand? Why should we need them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's one thing we touch on in the book that I think is one of the most potent, powerful examples if anyone spends a lot of time on social media. And I wouldn't say that we've explored this metaphor fully, but we look at the rise of the use of the word narcissism and how often that gets thrown as a label, even by solid posters. It's not just like an insult that gets flung, but the usage of that is an exponential curve, coinciding with the introduction of things like social media. In the myth, Echo is the name of the nymph that falls in love with Narcissus. And so you have the idea of an echo chamber in social media, followed by the continual rise of narcissistic behavior. And we throw these labels out, we throw these words out, and how many of us are aware of this intense connection that we see in the myth. And so on a society-wide level, that's just one example of the way that there's very strange synergy between myths and what we see happening in groups. And in the book, we dive into looking at groups in the forming stage and the coincidence with some of the pieces around the Norse creation myth, and about the importance of finding that Goldilocks zone where there's preservation of individual identity, but also people invited into taking on a healthy group identity, and kind of the dangers at both ends of those spectrums, which looks like complete alienation from the group or complete enmeshment and groupthink. So we dive into some of those. Those are just kind of a couple off the top of my head, at least. Aodhán, feel free to jump in.
Yeah. Well, I think what came up for me is that stories are a step away from someone's personal experience. So it's a way to get lost in a narrative, and the narratives that stick with us throughout time, if they stay around in a culture over thousands of years, there's a staying power to the story. And then if, when someone is reading a story, a child is reading a story like Hansel and Gretel, particularly the older versions, there's a deep learning in there about the dangers of I don't know, getting engulfed in like, you know, too much protection or something as a child. But it teaches you these things at a very deep level, at a step removed, so that you're not personally involved and scared about, you know, about yourself. You're not like personally attacked, but it still teaches the lesson very deeply. And that's, you know, that's a big part of why the stories are so powerful, is because they're depersonalized self-development or something like this.
And you bring up Hansel and Gretel there, and I suppose with fairy tales, right, or with these kinds of stories, you notice not just some moral slapped onto it, like this is what you should do, but you see all the different parts, right? You see the different characters, and different fairy tales can sort of make one character prominent, but they're all there. And so you know, why we read stories is actually, in a way, sometimes you read stories and you're like, I'm not learning anything from this. I want more nonfiction. I want something which is like concrete to the real world. But then in a weird way with these mythological stories, you're learning in a more deep sense about the patterns and recurring themes that can be present in any aspect of your life. And so then it seems more important.
Yeah.
That idea that you know, if you see something in the human affairs, you know, like the most existential things like love and coming together and leaving, and you know, all of these archetypal deep human like affairs. But if you see it 1,000 times and then someone crystallizes it in a story, and then, you know, that I love that argument of like, which one is more true, like the fictional story that tells the perfect outline of the 1,000 versions of that story, if I'm making sense, or the 1,000, they're both real, but you know, one is like archetypally real. It's like, this is the through line through all of these similar situations. This is what happens. And then obviously there's like individual variations of those, but yes.
Yeah. If you have a good Jordan Peterson impersonation, he's like it's the hyper real, right? Doesn't he call it? Yeah. Two things that came up when you were talking about that, Jack. One is there's, between the hardcore old school thinkers like Marie-Louise von Franz, and I don't know if Bly would agree with this or not, but they actually discern between fairy tales and myth. And so like Marie-Louise von Franz believes that fairy tales are the more pure form of accessing the unconscious. Myths have basically gone through the societal filter of, at least from one perspective, of religion, effectively. And we're looking at myths that the stuff that we're working with is mostly not currently religiously active relics from the past, right? So the Greeks, the Norse mythology type of stuff. Whereas the fairy tales are like, you know, much more dreamlike in a way, less cohesive. And I think that both are valid. I actually, for the work we were doing, we stayed with the myth side. So looking at stuff that actually has passed through that society filter or that cultural filter and been integrated into religious, scripture or whatever of the time. And then the other thing that you brought up, and I think this is, you know, where it's whatever in some sort of culturally sensitive realm here, but I think that might be one reason why there is so much backlash when you have Disney and all of these other companies that are like, hey, you know what, we're gonna just like take this old myth and this old story and just like switch it up to fit whatever we feel like the flavor of the day is, or to fit a certain political perspective, and that, you know, you see a lot of discourse online like, why does this rub people the wrong way? Are you just old-fashioned? And at some point, we might be asking, you know, are we getting away from archetypal stuff that we know works, that we know resonates at a deep level?
Jonathan Pageau makes a lot of these points that fairy tales are deeply describing reality. And so even as children, like, we can notice that if you start changing and warping fairy tales to some ideology, as a child, you'll just notice like, this is not as good a story, you know? Mm-hmm. And we need the fairy tales, the mythological stories to be gripping and good, because I suppose, just to relate to what we were talking about, when it's like that, it's telling us something in non-propositional sense about how reality works. And so I don't think you really can. And as Aodhán said, they develop over thousands of years iteratively. So no one person is just creating from nothing these stories, right?
Yes, I love that. It's like a cultural accretion, and if you're trying to twist a cultural accretion that emerges from like that dream-like space, like slowly over thousands of years, and then you try and twist it to an ideology, then then that's a bit screwed up. And I love the Cultural Explorer on Twitter. He's that huge writer, but he posted about the Disneyfication of fairy tales, and he like showed the old Brothers Grimm version of the Red Apple, Snow White, and then he showed the Disney version, and he's like, it's sanitized of all of the danger, and therefore teaches kids nowhere near what the older version taught them.
The old ones are brutal.
Yeah, they are. They're scary as hell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're jagged. They're brutal. It is that. It's like, imagine that you kept a dream journal and you like edited your dreams as you were writing them down. Like they lose the potency. It's like, well, I actually didn't do anything bad in this dream, as opposed to, whoa.
Yeah. And maybe Elon Musk and us, modern neuroscientists so smart, will try and edit dreams and make them better, the ones we want. Me and my friends are joking about this. Like, dreams feel so important because they're telling us stuff as it is. Even if we can't understand it, it's sort of like, this is what's happening, and it might take years to you won't even ever know what the dream means. But if you didn't have them, you could just manipulate them. Probably die. I don't know. There's something bad would happen, because you kind of need this, especially if we're we got technology in all parts of our lives. If we start manipulating our dreams, our unconscious is going to be like, guys, please stop. This is so dumb. So tell me a bit more about, imagine we then try and apply mythology to groups. What are some examples about that we can see? What kind of patterns do we see show up in groups?
Yeah, I think starting with how groups form is a good place, and that's what we do in the book. We make the case that creation myths are a tool to analyze the patterns that come up in groups as they're forming. I think good leaders intuit this in some ways. Folks who have worked with groups but may not have formal training, they find their way into some sense of understanding without maybe having the language for it. But Bion adapted some of Klein's ideas around this idea that when a group is forming, there's an inherent dilemma for all the members, and you have to decide effectively how enmeshed you're willing to become, and what your strategy. And this is where we can get into some of that like game theory nerding out. Jack is like, what's your strategy for preserving your individuality? Certainly in different groups, it feels different. Like if you go to boot camp in a hardcore military setting, it's going to be very, very difficult to try to preserve individuality in some ways that agree with the setting. And you have to make certain sacrifices. There's like a survival piece of it. And so, but we can look at any group. It can be any board meeting. It can be an intramural team that you join. It can be any historical group. This works in any context. It's just an individual has to balance, who they are with what the group is demanding of them. There's often competing needs, and extreme examples of staying an individual in the context of a group forming is really bad news. We look at ancestral, evolutionary type of forces at play. That means you're like not close to the fire effectively. That means you're closer to the scary wilderness or even expelled from the group. In modern times, I think that's the part of the psychology behind things like school shootings or self-harming in like teenagers. It's often rejection based. And then on the flip side, we don't have to reach far at all in historical context to look at things like the Salem witch trials, or I use that one because it is not a politically charged one. I think we can find examples of tribalism that are rampant and effectively out of control right now in the political sphere. But it's like a Salem witch trials. The group was gripped by this zeitgeist, and it was so powerful that they were killing off members of their own group. And this idea of this cleansing the witches, and we use the metaphor of the fire versus the ice, like in the Norse metaphor or the Norse creation myth. There's the middle ground is where life is formed. Originally, there's like a land of fire and a land of ice, and if you get too close to the group enmeshment, that's like the fire burning away your individuality. If you get too far away, you're apt to freeze.
You need to be in groups, right? And that's the difficulty as well. And like even in like social settings, I do some martial arts or do some dancing, and then you kind of realize that just to be able to do a shared activity, which you want to do, you kind of end up being you must take some role. And sometimes for me, it can be a bit almost, maybe I'm used to being more the leader, but now I'm more in the backseat, and you can kind of notice these patterns. But then sometimes you can't necessarily do anything about it, and what do you do? Sort of, maybe this is what kids do though, when as they're growing up, sometimes they go like, I'm not playing with you now, I'm leaving, but then over the long run, it's like, okay, that's kind of not going to work. You brought up like in our modern day, especially with social media, we have more cancel culture. We actually it doesn't seem like a group, it's just on the internet, but there's also a way in which we have this social belonging and identity to people, even if it's through technologies and digital media. And so then to be able to cancel someone and push them out, and I mean that.
Yeah. Well, Bion calls that a core need. You don't see it on Maslow's hierarchy. You don't see it. You see Glasser, who's another, I think, fairly controversial figure for people who are aware of him. He's got his core needs list that includes belonging, but specifically Bion was talking about grouping, group membership, joining. That's a core need for emotional long-term health. I think of it on the same, somewhere in the same realm as like self-esteem, where you can get by for a week or so. It's not the same as like oxygen, right? Like you need that real quick. But yeah, you're not going to be a healthy person overall for any sort of long-term stretch if you are not grouping, like the need to group.
Do you think that two people, like a pair, could be a group? Why does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would imagine that meets at least part of grouping needs and social needs, but we don't consider that. We explicitly say 3 or more people with shared interdependent interests is how we define a group in our book, which applies to that, for example, that would apply to a loose form of folks like strangers riding the bus. They have interdependent interests where, and you see it happen when like a disaster happens or a car wreck happens, people suddenly are cohesive. And we have this idea of there being this potentiality for groups all around us all the time. But which groups are actually active in our minds is like a product of the situation. And so you don't think of yourself as being in a group on a bus typically. You probably think of yourself as being in a group with the people you got on the bus with, like your friends that you're sitting together with. But if some emergency happens, suddenly people, like someone has a heart attack, I'm a medic, but people start taking up roles based on both their skill set and their personality, and just what we would argue is like the group unconscious coming alive as well. And so the group is there, it's just not active, so to speak.
Yeah, like even where you sit on a bus is like, that's the group unconscious coming on. Like you choose to sit beside the man instead of the woman. It's like, why? What? And then you can just, you can extrapolate from there, and then you can think about the group unconscious, and that's where me and Brant met, and how the book started was we at these group dynamics conferences. And a lot of that is like something as simple as, checking the time or leaving the room at a certain time, where you sit, like all of these things are data, to like inform you on what's happening at an unconscious level.
I read recently, I can't remember where it was. It was some group Dynamics book, I think. And
Yeah.
they defined, I think they used an example. They said like a group of people on a bus is not a technical group. And they're just wrong. It's just incorrect. In the book, I talk about, I don't know why this example is so relevant to me, but if I hear Mandarin, it reminds me of when I was studying abroad in Chengdu, China. It is a really defining chapter of my college time. And, you know, if I hear that, it like takes me back. And suddenly those groups that are, you know, I think of the students I was around, I think of the program I was in. It's like it recruits me back into these groups. And those were potentialities, but not really active in the moment until this trigger happens. And suddenly that group is salient. You know, so it can happen really quickly, and groups exist in like Russian dolls, where you're in one group, and I mean this is how we see this occur in work teams, for example. You know, you care about yourself, you're in a smaller work team that's in charge of a project, you're part of a bigger subgroup within the organization in your division, and like at big corporations, that like game of Russian dolls gets pretty large. And you know, you might be in a company-wide Zoom meeting where the CEO is giving an inspirational mission statement type of stuff, and everyone feels cohesively as a group in that moment. And then you get a DM from somebody on your work team saying something's going wrong, and suddenly like your world dials in, and you're much more focused on this smaller group subsystem. And a lot of the time, that's where those subsystems can rub against each other, and you get just like enormous emerging complexity and.
Yes,
I mean, cool stuff happening. Yeah,
I'm thinking about like the William White stuff, and you know, gossip in organizations, and when things aren't allowed to be said in organizations or in groups. You know, it's kind of interchangeable almost here. But when things aren't allowed to be said, then you know, that's one thing that can happen is like a subgroup or a back channel forms where you can say what you need to say. You know, but you say what you feel like you need to say, but it's in an indirect way. So then that's when things like, you know, people aren't following the leader anymore for some reason. Yeah.
I mean, and like one thing I had on my notes that I even wanted to ask you guys about is the way in which, say, sports teams, football teams, they kick out managers, and it's funny how when you kick out managers, you kick out leaders, it's hard for them to play any role in the team anymore. It's like you kick them out, and they played this sort of central dynamic. And I wonder, like sometimes with football teams, say whatever, it seems like at a certain point the leader dies in a way, or it no longer works, and the team in the background have sort of gone like, they're in theory, you know, job title manager, but I just don't see how this. It's not just a top-down authority thing. They can just say, I'm the leader. There's also a way in which, if the whole group doesn't see it working for them, then certain players, like, even if they don't notice it, maybe they're not playing as well. And I mean, maybe that's a form of rebellion even as well, unconsciously. They don't want this leader.
Yep.
Yeah. We talk about the progression and overthrow and the dynamic nature of hierarchies, which is what you're describing, basically. I think there are two important lenses to have as you're thinking through that. One is that just Tuckman's group stages, which is super simple. Most people have bumped into that in one form or another. The idea of like forming, norming, storming, performing, adjourning, all this stuff. Each of those phases, to me, if you think about Bion's ideas of looking at the unconscious drives of a group, and that being a shifting landscape to where the group is unconsciously engaged in fight or flight, or unconsciously engaged in codependency, or unconsciously engaged in any number. And we have a more extensive application of, like, we think there are more than just the three, at least I do. But the group needs shift, and leaders often attach themselves to meeting one specific need, right? And so and that if a leader isn't flexible and isn't able to shift to meet the evolving needs of the unconscious group, usually the group will find a way to kick them out or replace them. Sometimes that doesn't even mean firing them explicitly or kicking them out or killing them historically or exiling them. Sometimes they become disempowered. You know, you look at the I think the crown in England is an example of more of like a symbolic leadership or whatever. Sorry, Aodhán, I know this is a historically sensitive but you look at leaders that get disempowered without necessarily being like killed off. That's a thing. And yeah, just this idea that the group, when it's in its forming stage, is looking to navigate certain anxieties around what its purpose is, how its members fit together, who's in, who's out. And the leader that steps in and raises their hand or is elected in that context isn't necessarily going to be able to lead. They might be able to lead from A to B. And then once the group gets to B to C, it's a question mark. Like, can they adapt? Can they shift? If they're still trying to execute the same leadership strategies and hold the same kind of archetype for the group, oftentimes that's when a leader gets killed off. Aodhán mentioned the gossip. You guys were talking about the gossip networks. That's one way that power shifts. If a leader is not meeting the needs of the group and isn't inspiring the group, if we're in a group and Aodhán and I don't feel like the leadership is aligned with our values and our goals, then we're going to start this like gossip sprouts naturally, and we're not going to even feel out of integrity because we're in service to that like group drive. And so you'll see, I would argue that the extent to which underground gossip networks are in existence, that says something about leadership not meeting all of the unconscious needs and desires of the group in some sense.
Yeah, it sometimes feels like a team, an organization can all be of one mind, and you imagine, look at sports and maybe a new manager's joined and they all feel integrated. But I wonder, do you think that can be healthy for organizations to persist and survive with gossip and there being back channel dynamics? Can that still be healthy, or because maybe the group has multiple goals? I don't know. How should we think about what a healthy group looks like?
It's kind of unavoidable, I'd imagine, right? So, isn't it? It's if you're in some sense, because people come to any group with their own emotional and experiential social context, and if they have learned that authority figures are unsafe and they don't provide for me, so everyone comes to a group with a big set of assumptions, deeply unconscious, and one might be, I can't speak up or I get punished, and then you can't speak up, and then the only way you can sort of get heard is by talking to people around about that. Yeah, it's very complicated, because then also the leader could actually not be giving people space to speak to their own issues or gripes.
Yeah, I don't know if you ever completely eliminate that, but I think there's an extent to which, the lower level members of an organization are going to be fascinated by the dramas that unfold in an organization. That's again, we're story-driven people. It gives us a lot of information. We're story-driven beings, and those narratives are how we orient. And so it's exciting. It helps us. We make the case that the gossip room mill is one of the ways that you kind of consistently determine whether you're aligned with what's appropriate. If you get a lot of information around how you should behave, and if you don't have access to that flow, you're at a disadvantage. There's a power structure that's created underground, and who has access to information. We've all probably met and known people who are the hubs of gossip, and it's hey, if something's up, this person knows. Everyone knows that when something comes up, this person gets that juicy tidbit first, and there's a lot of power in that, and there's a lot of power in who's excluded, right? And it's all below the detection of the org chart, right? None of that shows up on the organizational chart.
You made me think of a few things, and one is Peter Thiel, and I remember him saying that it says a lot about our culture that most of the founders in Silicon Valley are basically, on the spectrum, because they're able to just be outside of the consensus of so they don't need to be accepted, or they can just push against everyone telling them they don't need to. They like, you're not going to be successful, and they're like, well, you know, I'm not going to listen to everybody, and I'm going to go on, and then they're very successful. And he says, you know, that reminded me of that.
This is maybe getting off topic, but it's interesting because it's a specific historical context where that feels more true. And if you look back at, I'm just imagining tribal living 100,000 years ago or whatever, like, I would imagine a lot of people that thought that way end up getting punished really drastically. And, you know, if you're in a small tribe and you're like, hey, fuck you guys, I'm going over here, you know, you're likely to die pretty quick. And in the right context, that can be an extremely helpful trait. And yeah, there's just like layers to how that interacts. I'm trying to think, I don't know, Aodhán, do we have like specific, like what archetype or what character would you give that?
I don't know if we have, but like the Maverick.
Mm-hmm.
That's one word for it. The Maverick. The Maverick.
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult one because, as you say, in evolutionary time, maybe it's quite a somewhat new phenomenon. Like, they would have existed, but they would have had to stay part of that same group in a sense, or, you know, at least join some group. Like, there's a way in which I know a tech company is a group, but it's sort of like, you think about your Peter Thiel, very big tech titans, they kind of deal with them. They're so competent. They bring that skills they have and they just sort of pull people around them. But like, directly clashing with other groups, but they can sort of hold that intention and then still do what they, and maybe it's fascinating to think, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, it has brought us new technologies, but we don't know how that's supposed to play out, right? Like, they started this thing by just saying, I don't care about other people's values and intentions, and then, you know, but will they ever be reintegrated? Like, because that continue forever?
Yeah, it's like perpetual reformations.
Fantastic.
Yes, yeah, like constantly rebelling. Again, this is a little bit off topic, but I thought it was so interesting, and it was Steph Smith. She is a very popular online technologist, and she runs A16Z's podcast. And she was talking about how creation is always rebellion. As in, like, creation is always an act of rebellion from consensus. As in, I just don't agree with that. You know, creation always comes from an accretion or something before you. So it's not like you're deleting everything behind you. And I guess that plays into the ideology and the myth as well, where you're trying to delete everything before you or twist it to your ends.
I mean, in part, say something like this podcast, in a way, it's a part rebellion of, I think, in typical academia, there are not topics and convergences between topics that are explored in detail. So I want a podcast format that's going to be able to look at philosophy in relation to psychology, in relation to whatever I want to. But then again, I'm very agreeable. I wouldn't want to completely smash down the existing structures. I want to sort of go, hey, we can add this new thing. But, yeah, it's, like, if we think about evolutionary time, if someone is trying to form and say, like, they're going to leave this group and then they can survive by themselves, survive in another group, it's, does that engage threat dynamics? Like, even if they're doing a positive thing, which, like, on one level you could deem as positive, they're creating stuff, we can buy those things. Is that just perpetually in our culture go, hey, you got to watch out because this person is in a one way not cooperating with us? I don't know.
Yeah, it's your trust. Can you trust? Like, I think it comes back to trust as well. Like, yeah, you can't really get very far without people trusting each other, right?
Well, I would say too, it probably depends on what's unconsciously going on in the group. You know, the response that the group has to a disruptor. You know, you can. I don't know. This is something we might add into another book if we end up putting. I have it written as one of my bullet points that we don't address in the book. But I believe that there are, in any sort of like archetype that can exist, there's kind of two polarities or two options. And I think that groups can often look at, okay, hey, this person is a disruptor, and whatever that archetype means for us, we can take them up in one of two ways, like the shadowy way or the kind of the light side way. And so, the Messiah, right, would be a disruptor that is accepted and seen as like put on a pedestal effectively. And the shadowy side of that is rejection and seeing red, like bloodthirst, like trying to attack. It's not a neutral archetype. You're usually going to get a pretty strong reaction one way or the other for a real disruptor that's stepping in and actually effective in actualizing that archetype. But I mean, here we are.
That leads us into the scape. Yeah, exactly. It leads us into the scapegoat. Like this is the scapegoat.
Right. Yeah. That would be. So it's you can. Right. So I think that's actually maybe a good way of saying that. Right. It's like the group. It's like, what kind of mood are we in? And it really, when I say that, I mean, what kind of unconscious drive are we actualizing right now? Are we going to allow this person to be a messiah and like cooperate with this, or are we going to scapegoat them and aggressively go after them? And I mean, that is a risk of being a disruptor. You see in tech, if someone's successful, they're lauded and held on a pedestal, and we basically reward them in as many ways as we know possible in our culture. And if they, then on the flip side, you got like Elizabeth Holmes and folks who have these spectacular fall from graces.
Yeah, I'm really interested though then, because then you have the people who despise Elon Musk and like serious hatred, and like the projection that's going on there speaks a lot to the unconscious as well. Like, how not that I don't know if you should intrinsically trust any Trump, any Elon, anyone in politics at all. But like, it's very interesting to see the reactions, and then you can, what's going on there unconsciously. Like, why do people want to believe certain things that don't seem to check out? These kinds of things. Yeah.
I also think in our modern culture we see such prominent figures displayed as icons in the popular consciousness, and we can never interact with them. They're across the ocean, whatever, but we kind of can't, because there's digital media, and we feel like we're seeing everyone, and we have such a grasp of the whole world with the internet. But then in another sense, I'm never going to know Elon Musk personally at all, and so all I can really do is project onto him. And
yes.
And so I can see why that those dynamics would become so hot, and it kind of caricatures these people, because how can you see Elon Musk for what he is when surrounding him, like centers of gravity, are people? I view him as this, I view him as that, and
yes.
I wonder, in more generally, dynamics of, because even in a book you kind of even use these group dynamics to think about, say, like nations and different. Like one example I was thinking about when I was reading your book is why, like, I think at one point Scotland and France were allies, and then they were against the English or whatever, even though you think, shouldn't they also be like enemies? And so it's interesting how sometimes people can become enemies or or friends depending on sort of the dynamics of people around them. And I wonder about that as well.
Yeah, what are the group goals? I guess that's what we're going to is what's, so there's to go back to the theory, there's like a primary task, and then what does the work group, what the group that works towards the primary task, say in like a company, it's like, whatever, develop these widgets. Why? But when the group is taken off the task, when the job isn't getting done, when the widgets aren't getting made, what is it? If it's not, obvious things like things breaking, why can't people work together? And then it's like in that, the unknown, that's where these kind of unconscious pieces come in together. Yeah,
it's funny. I remember it just reminds me of even at school, like in drama, weird subjects I didn't really like, and then to be some group, and I'd be like, there is no way we'll be able to. We'll have to just show this to our teachers with no work done, because I don't know, like especially in school, because the actual goal set by the teacher is very kind of ephemeral. Like we don't really care about this, and we're maybe friends or whatever. We know each other in class, so just those dynamics feel way more salient, and I cannot escape them. And so again, it just links back to the previous point of just because some goal is set from authority, you need to do this, but again, like our time is valuable, and we have these relationships within the group. So if they're just more important, like maybe the thing set from above just sort of is ignored.
Yeah, and you might ask what is the actual mission of the group, right? So Aodhán mentioned the idea of a work group, which is just to say, if the group has a mission statement that's explicitly said, or any organization has a mission statement that's explicitly said, the fantasy that people have is that everyone's always working towards that. And the reality is that they're doing what they want and they're getting pulled in unconscious directions. I mean, if I'm being honest, right? Like imagine it's all these things you're not allowed to say. Like if you're in a work group, or if you're in a school group, a project group, or a team, and you have to navigate things like attraction in the room. If you're like with someone you're really attracted to in your group, like the actual whatever mission statement feels way less important maybe than navigating those pieces and making sure you don't lose standing. If you have an attraction is power. And so if you have, or the person who like gets the attraction has power. And so I've seen that play out plenty, where it's like attractive member is not interested in the work and other members are pretty quick to reorient around what that person prioritizes. And maybe it's not like sexual attraction. Maybe it's, power in the sense of certain members becoming like the jester that's distracting away from the work. And this idea of like fun and goofing off and avoidance of that work is really fascinating to the group. And you just see these like nobody like shakes hands on this. Nobody explicitly signs any papers, but everybody almost in lockstep is able to make that shift or get left behind by the group. And so it's like, okay, we're slacking off now. This group is about joking off and having fun and effectively, in a sense, like sabotaging that explicit goal by doing something else. And that something else, we all feel it, but there's power in being able to define that, being able to think about what is it that we're actually working towards or pursuing, because we keep not hitting our metrics for this other goal that's explicitly said. So there's something else going on. Like, what are we not allowed to say? And pretty much every chapter in our book is like attempting to weave mythology into answering one of those questions. It's like, what's actually going on here?
Yep. You reminded me of the Norwegian workshop we did, where so we did a presentation, and then part of it was, letting people organize themselves into groups, which we like to do because you get to see what happens unconsciously. And then there was one guy there, right? And everyone organized around him. He didn't move. And then I talked to him after, and he was like the senior executive CEO of a big company. And I guess it's like, why did everyone know to organize around him? No one knew this guy here, but everyone seemed to just organize around him. It was interesting, and why did that happen like that?
Right. So they didn't even know. A lot of people in that room did not even know that he was a powerful individual, quote unquote. Right. And so, there was the group pretty quickly like put him in that position, and he knew, right? Like he didn't move, it's like a, all this stuff. And just all this stuff happened unconsciously while they were watching our presentation. They weren't like talking and comparing. It was like, we talked at them, marginally interactive. It was mostly us like lecturing, and then we had them group, and the unconscious, just like that, had them orienting around specific members who held power. It was pretty cool.
No, it's if you're imagine you're in class with friends, and then you know the teacher's gonna say, "Oh, I remember in judo doing martial arts, you know you're gonna be asked to be in your pairs, so you just sort of slowly shuffle over to the people that you wanna, be with, and then you maybe don't even notice, you weren't even told that you were gonna later be in pairs. Yes, I mean, you can apply game theory here too, very interestingly, right? Maybe you see a few people moving and you just barely notice that. And so, yeah, you don't even know explicitly this is a person with power, but just from what everyone else is doing, you're kind of gaining information about, what is going on and why you might want to do that, huh? Yeah, I mean,
it's funny. So you're talking about judo, and I just moved across the country to Tucson. Well, to somewhere. I don't know if I wanted the internet to know, but so I went to this gym I hadn't been to, and I wasn't even in this like lens, but now that you say it, of course, all these unconscious dynamics. You go in. I'm like 6'3", 200 pounds, so you march in and you're getting, it's like a friendly vibe, but you're getting a little bit like sized up. People kind of asking vague questions, hoping to get some information around like, how good are you at this thing? Pairing, there's all these little factors that go into, like you said, like the pairing and that's an example where you have rolling membership, and every time a class happens, there's different people in the room. And so I'm like coming into a system, and somewhere down in my psyche are questions around like joining and, again, navigating that, like, how do I kind of be myself, but also be in, like, join the group a little bit? Who do I partner up with? I'm like nursing some hurt ribs. And so I'm like kind of sizing up like smaller people that aren't going to like maybe smash me as much. And just all these little pieces, but it's just at some level, there's these unconscious forces. I can like name the rib thing, for example, is like a conscious decision maker, but yeah, I mean, we don't escape any of this. It's like always present with us in groups.
No, it reminds me of even Andrew Tate talking about how, maybe you don't notice it, but for him, it's like, obviously I'm going to look at how can I win every fight in here, like what if there was, even, or Jocko Willink, like, again, I'm just living two safe environments, but when he's gone to war, he's sort of, his mind is always, actually, how am I supposed to look for who can I associate with, who can't I? Yeah. Where are the exits? Have you seen the clip? I have to send it to you, and people have to watch it. The clip of him on Williamson's podcast. So they clipped out a part of the podcast where Chris puts his hands on the table, and Jocko's eyes are just doing this, looking at his hands every few seconds. Like that's like deeply embedded in him. Like what's he doing with his hands? and like all those military guys that are serious, like have been, that walk the walk. They like check for exits when they walk into any building. Like they're like, where's the exit?
Jocko is interesting too. He's like, also a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and shouts out Jocko. I know Aodhán, you had shouted him out on Twitter, and he said to go to the gym to give him a book, right? Like I need to go out to San Diego and visit his gym. I've trained with one of his black belts. He's an awesome dude as well. And Jocko though, is like, if you've read his book, or his first book at least, oh my God, Extreme Ownership, he's arguing for actualization of like a specific type of archetypal style of leadership is what I would say. And this is me putting like my lens on it, but you're talking about, it's like an instruction manual into the mind of a certain type of heroic leader, which I wouldn't say I would endorse as always the appropriate leadership style, but very effective for the environments he's been in. And, he calls that like leadership, like that's leadership. And that's his style. But to me, it's like a very specific archetypal style. And it's, it's kingly. It has, and I mean that in the archetypal sense, where he's generative, he's attuned, he's well-rounded. He has a high level of like, it's a young man's leadership game where he's in the trenches. And there's a lot of value in that for that specific style. But there's a lot of cool stuff in there. And I think it's cool to see that as a lens of him talking about the warrior hero leadership archetype effectively.
Yeah. And he takes a lot of blame as a leader, saying that's the right thing to do. But I wonder, and reading that book, and then in the small leadership positions I've been in, I've tried to do that more. But then it doesn't. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I haven't had too much experience, but then sometimes I go, I'm doing this badly, or I can't do that.
Well, what is it? It's a need for control. And if he needs to control you would need, if you take extreme ownership, you're taking complete control over every situation. So you're not relying on anybody. So it's
I think he approaches it. I think the nuance with him is that, and it's an interesting proposition, is him saying effectively, like, you can't control everything, but you can take ownership for everything. And so that means like owning failures that aren't yours.
I like that a lot.
That's part of managing the group dynamic. Yeah. What was I going to say? What did you say right before that, Jack? There was something. Oh, yeah. What's hilarious, I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but I've had a few different CEOs or owners of companies that I've been in director roles with who get enamored with Jocko's book, Extreme Ownership, and their attempt to implement it is usually like accountability for thee, not for me. It's like I've had CEOs where it's like, this went wrong. Like, you need to take ownership. It's like, the whole fucking thing is that you start at the top modeling that and say, hey, I obviously I didn't support you. I mean, that's how that conversation is supposed to look. Like, yes,
I see.
This is the game theory piece, right? Like, Jack, if you're in an environment, and this is why I think we got to like start thinking in game theory terms around the unconscious dynamics and the unconscious games that are being played. Because if you are under Jocko and he's legit operating from a place of extreme ownership, right? It becomes like the game is that it'd be unsafe to be blamey at that point. He's creating a culture where the game is like, oh, you better own your shit because he's owning his. And he's going to notice immediately if you're trying to deflect blame, and he's going to hate it. And that's like from the leader who has a lot of power and it's coming top down. And now if you're in an environment where you're with a CEO who preaches the idea of extreme ownership, yet at every other stop in the organization, I mean, but he starts off by blaming and that, like, you would never have that statement come out of Jocko's mouth. Like, you need to take ownership for this. It's like the whole point is that he's taking ownership. And it starts there. And so now you have the freedom to take on the invitation is that you own your stuff too. And you own more than is even what you directly control. But the game theory implications for a leader who is accountability for thee, not for me. Suddenly you're incentivized to scapegoat and blame and spread that blame around. And everyone in the organization, in order to survive, you have to like play this game effectively. You have to look at what the unconscious network of incentives are. And I remember it's so funny that I'm sure Jocko addresses this, right? Like, I'm sure he's addressed weekend warriors, like dudes with a gut who read that book and are like, yes, I am also part of Task Force Bruiser. And they like go in there and they think that the application is to make those damn middle managers be more accountable. And like, that's their takeaway is like ego driven. Like, I'm sure he's probably addressed that, but it's such a bastardization of the concept. And yeah, I love that idea of bringing game theory in, Jack, to think about what are the unconscious incentive networks that are happening based on that leadership style.
Yeah. It's difficult. It's difficult because you have to make this credible threat that it's actually going to suck at first, and you really have to accept that, I assume, if you really take on this leadership style, because you have to start taking on ownership of things which are and they're not going to feel like your problem. Or even there's that song that Akira the Don made called Good. Anything that happens to you, good. You break your leg, good. And I've sometimes, when I sometimes try to wake up early, I listen to that song, but then it's difficult because, it's like, sometimes stuff just seems objectively like it sucks, but you kind of have to take a more long run perspective of like, to be fair though, in the long run, you actually, if you try and take every situation, it's like you learn from it, or like, this actually was my problem. in some meta sense, maybe actually I didn't communicate. I didn't take on your problems well enough. But yeah, difficult though.
There's an idea in poker. If you're at a poker, I don't know if you guys play it or if have played, but if you're at a poker table, people are like, yeah, come on, give me like aces. I want aces. But over the long term, where the real money is made is in playing the marginal hands better than your competition. And so everyone knows that they have like a good hand when you get dealt aces and it's time to be aggressive or whatever. And people can still screw that up in a number of ways. But I love this way of thinking about it, where it's like the difference between an extremely good player and even a decent player or a medium player is going to be seen more directly in how they play some of these like middling hands that are pretty close, and that adds up over time. And so like that mindset of Jocko, it's like one way I see that is he's getting, it's like, okay, you got dealt a crap hand. That is an opportunity for us to demonstrate our edge over the competition. Like everyone's going to get bad hands in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. And, are those going to be those moments where you add up incrementally towards success, or where you like throw your hands up and play it poorly?
Mm-hmm. You've got to write that piece on game theory. Wow. So could you quantify the unconscious?
Yeah, I mean, so that's one of the reasons I think people may have either stayed away from it or that those two fields don't talk, right? Like if you look at Jack, and I'd love to hear your take on this. I'm certainly not an expert in game theory, but I do have some experience with it. It really is. There's more of like a linear way of thinking about it, of quantifying, of like mapping out the schematics of whatever. Like let's define what kind of either conflict or collaboration this is. What type of game is this? Is this a zero-sum game? Blah, blah, blah. And in the unconscious, it's like this imaginal realm. You're looking at best, you get to an insight that is congruent with the data you see, but you can never really know for sure that this is about dealing with a certain archetype or whatever. It feels like, to somebody who's purely hard science, it feels woo-woo. And it's not necessarily like, if you look at developmental psychology, like all of these concepts they're sound, but it's it gets squishy as you start to apply them. And so I think it's hard to like combine those two, but just the idea of looking at the network of incentives and the effectively like the rules of the game that happen in groups, which, applying game theory to the unconscious incentives that come up is a really rich potential field. And I don't think anyone's really doing it.
No. So, I mean, I think economists would want to say people, just individuals, and we want to keep it like that, even if it's not. We know groups exist, but we want to have a rigor, right? We can't just assume that any group exists as an entity, a thinking entity by itself, because then we could get any result. But definitely, especially more and more, like you actually run experiments and you see people playing games, and when there's no communication, but they can play things that are not Nash equilibria, or they can get to places in a way, let's say in like the possibility space of the game, they can get to cooperative outcomes, or they can get to really bad outcomes that they didn't even need to get to this outcome. They could have maintained at a level, but they all start like punishing each other, and then it's like this was equally needless. So there's actually a way in which looking at the dynamics, they're really
right. Those are the moments where there's room for understanding the unconscious dynamics better, right?
Yes.
Like if we get to a quote unquote nonsensical result, or we talk about that in the book a lot, like sabotage in organizations, things that
the behavioral stuff. The game theory would ignore the pure game theory. Behavioral game theory would ignore the emotional context, and then that's where the unconscious would really help. I wonder as well at AI, because AI, like LLMs, sort of work in an associative way similar to the unconscious. So if you could figure out how to map LLMs, AI, and game theory,
that would have to. That's a whole different thing for sure. But I do think I think game theory has tried to use like there's a recognition that different players, so to speak, or different group members will have different preferences and hidden preferences, even variable preferences. Like they have some words for these things, but there seems like there should be. I'll just speak from like my field's perspective. Organizational psychologists should be using game theory aggressively as a part of the lens that they assess organizations with. I went through grad school and got zero exposure to game theory. Nobody talks about Nash or what is it, Pareto efficiency or whatever. Like nobody's talking about any, like these are completely alien terms to people that are working within organizations under the guise of organizational psychology, in my experience. That needs to change. So
yeah. Let me send you some emails with things that you might find interesting. Well, Aodhán, you need to run, but this has been really fun, guys. I appreciate it. I appreciate the book.
Yeah. Thanks for your
patience. Thanks for reading and thanks for having us on. Yes, and your patience. Oh my God. Oh my God.
It's been fun, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, it was fun.
Cheers.